Hey, what's up, coders? It's Derek from the Derek Codes YouTube channel, and today we're going to be going over Laravel and some simple request validation. But first and foremost, if you haven't watched my last video, which was all about routes and controllers and storing data from an API in your database and feeding it back to the user in the API, go ahead and go back and watch that one first because it's a great prelude to what we're doing here today. So you might be asking yourself though, what is request validation? What is data validation? Well, it's Laravel's way of ensuring the data that you're given is what the data that you're intended to receive, right? So you're going to be using this in all of your HTTP requests. So anytime data is sent into your API, your controllers, let's say, you're going to want to use validation to ensure that's exactly what you're looking for. Like an email address is an email address, right? And it's properly formatted. So we'll dive into that in just a moment. We're going to show you some code. But it's really cool. The validator can actually be used outside of your controllers and receiving data. You can actually use it in, let's say, a cron job or a scheduled task that you have to send out an email, for example. You want to make sure that that email address is valid and legit before you actually send off that email. The validator allows you to do that. It's really, really cool. So without further ado, let's dive into some code. All right, now before we jump into the code, let's check out the documentation. And I want to let everybody know who's watching is never feel weird about referencing documentation and having it up on your screen all the time. No developer is going to know everything. A lot of times when I do these videos or when I'm coding, I've been doing it a long time, I'm not going to reference the docs. But there's always going to be these little syntax nuances or a feature or a nomenclature difference between different projects or different code bases or different languages. You're just not going to remember. So never feel weird about that. So I went into the documentation and I am going to change my version to PHP 8 just to be safe because that's what I'm working with. And I'll go under the basics and then validation. And this is where they actually get into all the different ways you can get started, and then obviously the different ways you can use it. You can not just for a controller. So we'll have this up on our screen to help us get started, but let's start diving into some code. All right, so we're going to switch over to our favorite code editor, whatever that may be. I'm going to pull up a store method, so where we actually are saving data in our controller that we built out last time. So again, if you haven't seen that video, go back and check it out. We set up everything that you're actually seeing right here today. And based on that based on that documentation we just saw, we're going to go ahead and build out the validator. So as you can see, we have three different things we reference in this controller: the name, the email, and the comment. So this is kind of considering we're building out a contact form, right? So someone's just going to put their name, email, and their comments in here. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to do a request validate. Give ourselves some space here. And the way that the documentation shows it, you pull that back up again, is you're providing the rules for this request that's coming in. So here's the request variable. You're building this validator, and then we're saying, hey, it's going to have a title and it's going to have a body, and they're both required, right? So we're going to do something very similar. But I wanted to make something a note for everybody right now is that this validator stops if it finds a flaw in that data that's coming in. It'll stop right here. It won't go any further. So all of your code down here, this is what's successful after the fact, right? So I'll show you in just a couple minutes, though, how I would handle it a little bit differently. But let's first and foremost dive into how they have it. So we're going to say our name field is required, right? Required. And it's a string. And then we're going to say our email is required, and it's a type of email. So this will actually validate as an email, but we're going to come back to that in just a second as well after we finish this. Required, if I could type, right? And it's a string as well. All right, so let's jump over to Insomnia, which is the REST client that I use to test all my stuff. And I'm going to take off my fields that I was posting. And you'll see now it comes back with a message. The given data was invalid, and it'll give us this kind of this object with arrays of values in it of the errors that need to be filled out. So it worked perfectly, right? Let's go ahead and put in the email back in there though, and make it an invalid email. It passed. It said, hey, your email's filled out. It's a valid email. It's got an @ sign in it. We actually don't think that's good enough, right? So we're actually gonna make this a little bit more specific. There's a bunch of different options in the Laravel validator to validate email addresses. You can actually use DNS, and you can use other things as well. There's a comma here. So the DNS will actually validate that it's a valid DNS, the domain name actually has an MX record, so which is pretty cool. I feel like it's a little overkill. I just use filter, which uses the PHP filter var method, which is a method. If you check out PHP website, we'll do that right now really quick. Pull up php.net. This is why there's no shame in checking out the documentation, right? So you search for filter _ var, and it's actually a method on here. You can pass in data, and you can specify the type of filter flag that you want to use. Where are all these filters? Here's a couple different examples. Here's one right now. It's validating an email address. Here's filter var. It's trying to validate if this email address is a valid email. So it works really well, and it's built into the PHP Laravel validator as well. So I'm going to go ahead and let's check this out in our REST client here. Now it says the email must be a valid email address. Boom, that's what we wanted. Make it valid again, and now it passes. So now we're still requiring our name and our comment in there as well. So let's put our name, great, our comment, refresh. Now it goes in. Beautiful, I love it. One of the things I mentioned though earlier is I really like clean code, right? And I like consistent code. And I think it was a recent video we were talking about APIs and what a pet peeve it is of mine when an API will return like a blank information. Like, was it successful? Is there an error? Like, what happened, right? So I take that to heart, and I'm going to build my code in a responsible way. And we talked about earlier, returning status 1 if it's successful, or down here, for example, if it all else fails and it doesn't get in here, it'll return a status 0. So I want to do the same thing with our validator. So right now, if something's not filled out, it's Laravel that's returning these errors. So if there's no status 0, there's no status 1. So I'd really like to make that consistent. So let me show you how I would do it. All right, so we're actually going to modify this a little bit. We're going to make this an array of rules like that, right? And then what we're going to do is remove some of this and say if validator fails, else. There we go. Just kind of setting myself up for success here. All right, so validator. All right, so we're going to instantiate this validator object ourselves, right? Before it was off the request object. Pull back up to their documentation here. So they're actually using this request object and using the validator object that's based on already instantiated. We're going to instantiate it ourselves. So the validator equals the validator object, making it new. And we're going to get all of our request variables. We're going to pass in these rules is what we're going to do, right? So this is not going to stop immediately and bail out and return the errors for us anymore. So what this is going to do is going to validate, and if it fails, it's like now we can respond with what we want to do. So I'm going to make a response here, make this an array. And status is 0. Errors. Validator errors. Like that. And then we're going to say return. Oh, you know what? I'm going to copy and paste. Save myself some time, right? I'm going to say response. All right, how's that? Let's go through just to make sure it all looks good. We have our rules array. The validator is instantiated with the request all. Passing in the rules. If the validator fails, we're going to return this response. Oh, it looks like we have a semicolon here. Let's get rid of that. We don't need that. I think that looks good. Let's give it a try. Go back over to our REST client, refresh. Nice. The email field is required. So it's returning a status 0 in an errors array, and it's telling us what the error is. So beautiful. This is exactly what we wanted. So that way our API is always returning a status 1 or a status 0 with some errors. So let's check these back off again and refresh. This time we got status 1, and it went and actually inserted it for us. Beautiful. Now that we've built out this simple validation for our contact form, the name, the email, and the comment, let's take it a little bit further and add an optional phone number. And we want to make it optional because not everybody likes to put a phone number in, right? And let's check out the way to do that. The first thing we'll have to do is add the migration to add that column on the table, right? So we're going to say PHP artisan. And just to back up for a moment, where I'm at right now is in the directory, root directory of our project, where the artisan command lives. So I'm going to use PHP space artisan, make migration, and we're going to call it the, let's say, the contact phone migration. And we're going to use these attributes that I've mentioned before. We can reference the table. We use this as for the contacts table. It'll actually pre-populate our migration with the table syntax, code that we need. So it saves us a lot of time. Let's go back over to our code editor here. Go to our database folder. Refresh this. There's our new migration. And in here, we're going to add a string of phone. Like I said, we want to make it optional. In this world, you call it nullable. It doesn't need to be filled out. It can be null. And as I've always mentioned, I like to keep my stuff clean, right? Even in my database. So I'm going to organize this, and I'm going to say add this new column after the email address. So our first migration, we pull that up. It was ID, name, email, and comment, and then the timestamps. We're going to add the phone number right after the email, just to keep everything nice and tidy. That looks good. So when we run the migration, it's going to create this nullable field of phone number. And then as you roll back, drop a column, phone. Perfect. Let's go ahead and run our migration. It's PHP artisan migrate. Yes, we want to run. It's been run. Perfect. All right, now let's go back over to our code editor. Close this migration. I'm going to duplicate our email line, but then I'm going to call it phone. And it's not required. It's going to be called nullable here as well. And it's just a string. We're going to accept anything anybody's got, right? All right. Let's go down here now. When we add it to the database, we're going to say if phone, copy and paste this. All right, and this method here is the bee's knees. It's awesome. So what we're gonna do is say we're saying if phone number, if the request has a phone number, add it. Otherwise, don't add it. Don't waste your time. So it'll be pretty cool. It'll allow us again to give that option ability within our code here. So I think our code looks good. We've added our table column. Let's go over to our REST client to test this out here. First, let's just refresh it to make sure one can get inserted just fine. No errors, great. Now let's add the phone number and leave it null. Cool. It was added as null, which is okay. Now we're going to add our phone number. See if it gets inserted. Boom, it is. Awesome. So now we've added an optional field. You can pass it if you want or not. They don't have to fill it in. If it's a form and you're always passing it in, it can be absolutely be null. The code's not going to care. It's a beautiful thing. Cool. Well, that concludes our video for today. I hope you learned a lot about validation in Laravel. It was a really simple example, but really crucial stuff. And we went a little bit beyond simple with those nullable fields. But as you can see with our example here today on this contact form, it's really, really useful stuff. You're going to be using it all the time. So super, super good stuff. Thank you so much again for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, comments, ideas for my next video, feel free to post those below in the comments. And if you get a chance, like and subscribe so you get it notified of the next video. Thanks again.